Hello, New Hampshire Realtors. I'm Marc Drapeau, your 2020 NHAR President. It's Monday, August 17th, and we're now 9 weeks into Governor Sununu's Safer at Home order, and the first full week of operating under the Governor's latest universal guidelines. We're going to get to the updated guidelines shortly with today's guest, but first I wanted to touch briefly on the most recent monthly housing report, which we released last week. That was the July report, and it included a statistical pandemic sales milestone. For the first time since January, New Hampshire actually showed an increase in residential unit sales from the same month over the previous year. After 5 straight months of declines, July sales were ahead by more than 6% compared to July 2019. In fact, the 2012 residential sales is the most in New Hampshire's recorded history for any July, and it coincides with the highest July median price ever at $340,000. A few other highlights from the July monthly indicators report showed more high sales numbers and continued historically low inventory. On the high side, dollar volume and closed sales was ahead of last year by 22%, and pending sales were up by 19%. On the low side, months supply decreased by 55%, and the number of homes for sales decreased by 54%, the lowest level of inventory in the last 20 years. To see the report, find monthly indicators on our homepage at nhar.org. And now let's talk about the latest universal business guidelines in New Hampshire. And to do that, I'm happy to once again welcome NHAR Legal Counsel, Matt Johnson. Great to have you with us, Matt.
Thanks for being here, Mark.
As I mentioned earlier, Governor Sununu's Economic Reopening Task Force revised its universal guidelines last week for all New Hampshire employers and employees to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We won't go into all the details, which can be found at covidguidance.nh.gov, but it's important to note that 1, NHAR interprets these requirements to apply to agents and employees utilizing brokerage offices, and 2, all employers within the state must follow the new guidelines to remain open. I want to ask you, Matt, about 2 significant pieces of the document, the mask mandate and also the requirement that employees are required to ask travel questions of employees. First, the new guidelines state that employees who are directly providing service to consumers or individuals must wear masks while providing such services. But then the guideline goes on to include the caveat where maintaining social distance is difficult. It seems like a pretty significant loophole from a legal standpoint. Now, what are your thoughts?
Mark, that's a great question, and I think that's a question that's being bandied about the state right now. I frankly wish the language had been a little clearer. The way I interpret that, though, is that I think you have to operate under the act as safely as possible at all times. So I read the must language that you should assume, or the default position should be, that if you're an employee at a workplace and you have any forward-facing interactions with customers in any capacity, that you need to have a mask on. Because part of the reality is the social distancing is there, but that's easy to do theoretically, but much harder to do in practice. So it's just much safer both for the business and for the employees and the customers just to wear your mask. Even if you're a little bit further apart than 6 feet, it's just much safer. And I think the way these guidelines have ratcheted up, I would say, or become stricter over time, there's definitely a policy view behind that it should be stricter. And so I think you should interpret that, and real estate agents should interpret that. If you're interacting with the public, wear your mask.
Thanks, Matt. Now I'd like to ask you to address the issue of the questions employers are required to ask of employees, in particular the travel question, and also the issue of should versus must when it comes to the 14-day self-quarantine.
Right. Again, I'm not quite sure why they keep bouncing back and forth between using should and must. When you read the document as a whole, my interpretation of that is that if an employee has traveled outside of the New England region and the Universal Business Guidelines specify it, it's Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, if they answer that yes, they have, that they need to quarantine for 14 days before they go back to work. I don't interpret that as a discretionary decision either by the company or by the employee to decide whether to do it. So I think employees need to be careful and need to plan ahead if they're going to take trips outside of this region, because I think there really is a belief or a view that you should be self-quarantining if you do that.
Thanks, Matt. Can you speak to enforcement? What's the state doing about enforcement of these issues?
So part and parcel of this Executive Order 63, which are the Universal Business Guidelines, late last week, Governor Sununu had Executive Order 65 that came out, and that was a shorter order, but it talked all about enforcement. So it talked about the fact that businesses and employees, you can be subject to $1,000 civil penalties. You can be charged with a misdemeanor if you do anything to recklessly violate these orders. So now it is a higher standard. It's not targeted to people who just made a good faith mistake, but it is trying to make it clear and send a signal to the business community that if you willfully or recklessly flaunt the rules and say, look, we're not going to do it, we don't believe they can do it, guess what? We have enforcement mechanisms. The order is interesting. It's a long paragraph, but it cites all the Superior Court challenges to the various executive orders that have been raised by individuals, all of which so far have failed. So basically the state saying, hey, look, we have the right to do this, and we have the right to seek enforcement and impose penalties if you violate it. So it's just one more factor to say, hey, look, the situation is not getting better. We are trying to take proactive steps. We are taking this seriously. We are arming our public health officials with the tools we need to try to make sure businesses comply. But again, it's not targeting if you make a mistake or innocent or anything of that nature. It just, look, if it looks like you are knowingly or intentionally trying to disregard these rules, you can face consequences.
Thanks, Matt. That's very helpful information, and we certainly appreciate you joining us once again to share your insights. So that's it for this week. Thank you for joining our update. And as always, we ask that you share this with colleagues so that we can keep all of our members up to date with the news from NHAR. Stay safe, everyone.